Fashion. I am fashion. Needles and thread were the start of apparel construction. These basic items helped with the development of the more convenient way of making clothes, which is the sewing machine. Archaeologists believe that man used needles and thread to stitch fur, bark, skin, and hide together to make clothing 25,000 years ago. My major is fashion design, so I'm taking courses that deal with apparel construction, meaning that I'll be working with needles and thread. By informing you about this cultural artifact, you'll learn how needles and thread relate to the culture of fashion design. First, I'll discuss how this cultural artifact relates to the culture of fashion design itself. Then I'll explain how this artifact represents creativity and originality, as well as explaining how I myself relate to this culture. Needles and thread are symbols that represent the start of clothing making, creativity, and originality. In the past, people didn't have advanced technology to make clothing like the sewing machine. So what they did have were needles and thread, or items that were similar to needles and thread. For example, Native Americans used natural needles from plants or wood as needles. People went through the long process of stitching together fabrics together to make a piece of clothing. Needles and thread represent both creativity and originality. A person who's aspiring to become a fashion designer must have an artistic and creative imagination to appeal to the general public's interest in clothing. This is rather difficult to do because the public's interest in things constantly change. So a person who's making clothes, they have to be creative to think of different things to put together all the time. Originality is also a crucial part of fashion design because you have to make the piece of clothing your own. You have to own the piece of clothing that you made. Because if designers take the work of another designer, then their reputation would be ruined. Now that I have told you about how this cultural artifact relates to the fashion design culture, I'll now tell you how I relate to this culture. Fashion designing is a part of my life because it's my major. It makes me feel complete. It's something that allows me to express myself in a unique way. I only recently got attached to fashion design. I only started it last year, but it makes me feel me. It allows me to be myself with other people. When I'm designing clothes, nothing else matters, and I feel completely satisfied with what I'm doing. Designing also allows me to tell a story about myself. It allows me to express my personality. A story can be told through the colors that I choose, through the combinations of colors that I put together, through the different pieces of clothing that I put together, and the design itself can be a story. Believe it or not, I'm a shy person, so it's hard for me to get across who I am to people, but designing makes it possible for me to do that without the use of words. Now you have an understanding of how needles and thread are a part of the fashion design culture. First, I discussed how needles and thread relate to the start of clothing making. Then I discussed how this cultural artifact are symbols that represent the concepts of originality and creativity. I also explained to you how I relate to this culture. Fashion is not necessarily about labels. It's not about brands. It's about something that comes from within you.